The summer of the first year of the war came earlier than usual in the southern Don. By the middle of May, the gardens had already blossomed and the weather was hot, with rare and uninterrupted rains. June was scorching hot, and the penultimate Sunday of the month seemed to be no different from the previous weekends. The sun was shining just as brightly, and the bread was beginning to turn golden in the sprawling collective farm fields. Nothing special. But special things did happen. The war. It came to every home with inexorable inevitability, with merciless inevitability of grief, deprivation, and suffering. People were no longer able to enjoy the joy of communicating with nature. It seemed to them that the sun was no longer so bright. Green oak trees and apple orchards no longer beckoned with their freshness. We, the second-year cadets of the Rostov Infantry Military School, listened to the radio speech of V.M. Molotov, who announced the treacherous attack of Nazi Germany on the USSR, in formation, on the platform of the Persianovsk camps near Novocherkassk. Immediately there was a rally, at which all future commanders expressed a desire to immediately go to the front. But our hotheads were quickly cooled down. Before graduation is less than a month, told us, pass the exams, get the rank of lieutenant, then and go to war. Then, in the first days of the war, it seemed to us that we might not be able to make it to the front. The Red Army would defeat the Nazis with mighty blows from the ground and from the air without us. After all, everyone remembered the successful battles against the Japanese invaders on Lake Hassan, on Khalkhin Gol, the breakthrough of the Mannerheim Line on the Karelian Isthmus in the war with Finland. And at the classes on tactics, on other military disciplines, we were convinced of the invincibility of the Red Army, that the war, if it is unleashed by the imperialists, will blaze on the territory of the enemy. And what songs we sang in the cadet ranks. Armour is strong and our tanks are fast. Artillerymen, more accurate sight. The gunner is sharp, the scout is brave, and on the enemy's land we will defeat the enemy with little blood, a mighty blow. And these songs were sung not only by Red Army soldiers and cadets. The whole country sang. And of course, we did not think or guess at that time how heavy the invasion of the Nazi army would turn out to be for the motherland, that we would have to fight with the insidious and cruel enemy for almost 4 years, straining all our strength, losing millions of human lives. We were released from the school on July 15th, and I was assigned to the 963rd Rifle Regiment of the 274th Rifle Division, standing near Zaporozhye. And in 2 days I took a rifle platoon. Our regiment was building a defensive line on the right bank of the Dnieper, opposite the island of Khortytsa, which in the old days was a kind of headquarters of the famous Zaporozhian Sich. From our ospreys we could clearly see the dam of the Dnieper hydroelectric power station, a huge semicircle girdling the river, and even the rumble of water beating through the breaches could be heard. A week later I was ordered to take command of the company. Defensive work went on as usual. We carved out time and for combat training. Most of the soldiers were called up from the reserves, and they, of course, they were unused to military service. We entered the battle early in the morning on August 19th, and on August 20th I was already in the infirmary. Now, almost half a century later, it is difficult to reproduce the events of those 2 days. The names of Red Army soldiers and unit commanders have been erased in my memory. But I can firmly say, we did not let the Germans to the Dnieper. Soldiers of the company hit 3 enemy tanks with bundles of grenades, repelled up to a dozen fierce attacks. After the next battle, I called the platoon commanders to the NP. It was getting towards evening. It was getting dark. Me and the company's political officer, waiting for platoon commanders, came out of the stuffy dugout into the fresh air. 3 lieutenants came up. We all sat down on the ground behind the rear side of the trench. We began to discuss the results of the day, and it had to happen. A German mine exploded nearby. All 5 of us were wounded. 2 splinters hit me. One penetrated my boot and cut into my leg, the other hit me in the head. The polytruck got off with a light wound in the arm. 1 platoon member was burned on the side, and the other 2 had to be sent to the medical centre at once. Their wounds were more serious. When I reported by phone to the commander about these unexpected losses, he gave me a reprimand for the fact that I got out of the dugout with all the commanders and asked if I could command the company. I replied that I could. I almost didn't sleep at night. Hastily bandaged wounds hurt, and my soul was tormented. I punished myself for carelessness. And in the morning again enemy artillery raid on our positions, and a new attack. And again the soldiers did not falter. They fought back. In the excitement of the battle I felt better, but by evening I felt worse. The Politruk reported about it to the commander, and he ordered to send me to the infirmary. Accompanied by a Red Army medical officer, I wandered along the dam of the hydro station to the eastern bank of the Dnieper. From the infirmary, I was transferred to the Novocherkassk evacuation hospital. It was not far from the same Perzhanovsky camps from where we had left for the front a little more than a month ago. I was then only 22 years old, and maybe that's why the doctors quickly got me on my feet. Already on September 8th, I was discharged with the order to report to the Personnel Department of the North Caucasus Military District, and from there I was sent to the headquarters of the 343rd Rifle Division, which was being formed in Stavropol. Autumn in the North Caucasus is mild and warm. The leaves on the trees last long until the first frosts. Stavropol seemed to me a very green city. It was a warm, sunny day when I went to the station square. The building of the Pedagogical Institute, which housed the headquarters of the 343rd Rifle, was located in the upper part of the city, in the central market square, and it was not very difficult to find it. It was a large old stone house with wide corridors and many massive wooden doors. A short, stern-looking captain, the head of the personnel department, looked at my documents, waved my medical certificate, looked at the bandage on my head protruding from under my cap, and asked, "Did you get a big scratch?" "Just a scratch," I answered cheerfully. "My leg a little, and here, in the head." The captain grinned. "Well, how is it now, in the head, ringing?" "It happens." "Do you think well?" The personnel officer smiled openly. "I can't complain." The captain became stern again, remained silent for a few seconds, and then made a note in some journal and turned to the clerk. "Register him to Vasilkov." Then officially again to me. "You will go Comrade Lieutenant Naumenko, Assistant Chief of Staff of the 1151st Rifle Regiment. As a front-line soldier, you'll be promoted." "How can that be?" I burst out. "I commanded a platoon, a company, and you put me in the headquarters." "That's the way it should be," said the captain. "Bless you," and gave me his hand. It was explained to me that the regiment headquarters was not so far away, and the way to it led along Kavaleriskaya Street, which was a short walk from the Pedagogical Institute. From this street began the northwestern outskirts of Stavropol, which closely adjoined the remains of the ancient Black Forest, once stretched for dozens of kilometres along the course of the river Tashla, snake-winding among the wide ravines and deep gullies. Now from the green massif remained separate groves, city forest, forest Russian dacha, suburban forest. Kavaleriskaya Street, paved with large cobblestones, steeply descends to the Sipiagin pond. There, in the area of this pond, was the so-called Bibertova dacha. That's where I had to go. It was there, on the territory of the former pioneer camp, that the 1151st Rifle Regiment was formed. To the left and right along the street, mighty oak trees came right up to the road. Behind the low fences of one-storey, well-maintained, whitewashed houses, asters and dahlias were in full bloom. Just out of curiosity, I was looking closely at the names of the streets and alleys crossing Cavalry Street. When I read the next inscription, Krasina Lane, someone called me softly. I stopped and saw a blue-eyed girl in a red chintz dress with large white polka dots. With one hand she was pulling her tightly woven braid across her chest, and with the other she was holding the chubby little hand of a girl of about 7 with large, wide-open eyes on her tanned face. Both looked at me, as it seemed to me, with anxiety. The older one, a little embarrassed, took a step toward me, said a polite hello and asked, Excuse me, Comrade Commander. You're from the front, aren't you? How is it? Where were you wounded, if it's no secret? Yes, I'm from the front. And about the secret. What secret? Near Zaporozhye. And here? She nodded towards the girl. Daddy's been in the war since the first days. I thought I'd ask you if by chance you met with Pyotr Makarovich Kolodny. Anything can happen. Even without waiting for an answer, she guessed from my surprised look that she would not learn anything from me about her father. She nodded understandingly, wished me a good journey, and smiled affectionately in farewell, and I said, "Do not lose hope, girls. Everything will be fine. Your father will return with victory." Maybe because I first heard a rather rare surname, it stuck in my memory. And it was about 6 months later that I heard it again. Apparently, my headband clearly elevated me in the eyes of people. I noticed it even earlier, right after leaving the hospital. Everyone wanted to help wounded frontline soldiers in some way or another, and this fleeting meeting with the daughters of Peter Kolodny, who had fought somewhere, brought to mind a recent episode. At some station near Rostov, where I was going after hospitalization, our train was delayed. Like many others, I jumped out of the car for boiling water, but there was none. I looked. A marketplace near the platform. The inhabitants were selling all sorts of food. I ran there. A grandfather was sitting on the edge, laying out his goods. Boiled potatoes, pickles, and fried fish. All in one portion on a plate, all fresh, homemade. Of course, drooled. "How much?" I asked. And the grandfather smirks slyly. "You take it first, son, if you like it. Shall I put it down?" "Put it in," I said. 2 portions. He wrapped everything in paper. I went into my pocket for money. "How much?" "Not a thing," replies the grandfather. "Go with God. Have a good appetite, son. You lay down your life for us, so, get well. I fought in the Civil War, too." Then the locomotive whistled, the train jerked, and soon the station was out of sight. Nothing special happened, but a warm feeling of gratitude for human kindness awoke in my soul. And here before me is a picturesque place, Bibertova Dacha, a vast grove of century-old trees with thick foliage not yet touched by the autumn yellow. The pond was clearly visible from the hillside, with weeping willows along the banks, their branches long and flexible, hanging straight into the water. Under the shady crowns of stocky oaks, slender ash trees and mighty chestnuts, tents stood strictly in a row, and military men, serious and preoccupied, scurried back and forth. At the end of the wide alley one could see a 1-storied White House. Judging from the fact that a sentry with a rifle was walking at the entrance, I realized that this was the regimental headquarters. The sentry escorted me to the door and said, "The commander is here." In the large room where I entered, it was hot and stuffy, despite the open windows. 2 men were sitting at the table, a grey-haired lieutenant colonel who was no longer young, and next to him a stocky major with inflamed eyes. Near the window stood a swarthy, with oriental features of the senior political officer. He reported his arrival to the lieutenant colonel. He leisurely looked through my documents, looked at me once more, and turned to his neighbour. "Here you are, Nachtabar, a new assistant. As you can see, after a wound, a front-line soldier." Major, squinting his eyes, looked at me carefully, studying me, smiled friendly. The senior political officer also smiled and said, "People, already scorched by the fire of war, are very much needed in the regiment." "Well, Lieutenant Naumenko, let's get acquainted," said the lieutenant colonel, gesturing me to sit down. "You already know my last name, Vasilkov, and my name is Sergei Dmitrievich, Chief of Staff Ponomarev Nikolai Ivanovich. And this," he pointed his hand at the senior political officer, "our Commissar Sabir Kalilovich Ibragimov." So began my service in the regiment, with which I did not part almost all 4 front years, and with which I passed from the banks of the quiet Tashla to the Elbe, from Stavropol to Torgau and Prague. Our rifle regiment was formed mainly from the rural labourers of Ipatovsky, Krasnogvardeyski, Novo-Alexandrovsky and other districts of the Stavropol territory called up for military service. In the first decade of September were almost completely assembled rifle battalions and special units, communications company, transportation company, and others. Lieutenant F. P. Pismensky was appointed commander of the 1st Battalion. Senior Lieutenant F. F. Andreev was appointed commander of the 2nd Battalion. Senior Lieutenant E. P. Abramov was appointed commander of the 3rd Battalion. 180 members of the All-Union Communist Party and 97 Komsomol members joined the party and Komsomol organizations of all units. 23 company party and 21 Komsomol organizations were established in the unit. The secretary of the party bureau of the regiment was elected political officer Beaf Antonenko, a man with a long party experience, possessing outstanding organizational skills, the ability to persuade people hotly and persuasively. Regimental headquarters was not yet fully staffed with commanders, and therefore there was a lot to do. And day and night there was work. I participated in the preparation of plans for combat training, the development of tactical situation for demonstration and methodical classes, supervised classes in companies, and I had to train the soldiers. However, we all had the same rhythm. It was set by the regiment commander himself, who seemed to know no fatigue, had very little rest, but was always awake, energetic, demanding, assertive. He did not spare himself and did not let others down. Time is of the essence, he urged us. In October they will surely send us to the front. You see how things are going there. Yes, we all understood that the situation at the fronts in the fall of 41st was difficult. The enemy was rushing to Moscow, Leningrad, to the North Caucasus. Bitter thoughts troubled my soul. At first I was uncomfortable with the endless inputs which had to be solved immediately, from the multifaceted nature of the tasks. Even the thought arose, I will not cope, ask the company, and go away from these reports, schemes, descriptions to them, instructions and other papers. I would go to the people, to the place where it is necessary to lead the fight, shooting, marching. I even mentioned it once, being alone with the regiment commander, but Sergei Dmitrievich, usually reserved, reprimanded me. You whimper, so I wouldn't hear any more talk on this subject. I know better who should do what. It will be necessary, and the company will command, and battalion, but now pull the staff burden. This, Comrade Naumenko, will teach you a lesson for life. You won't get such a school at any academy. The regiment commander was restless, not just a conscientious serviceman, but a thinking officer. It is very interesting and instructive to work with him, although difficult. He now and then came up with different ideas, and he liked to put them into practice immediately. Once Vasilkov came to the Chief of Staff, who gave me instructions on compiling another summary to the division headquarters on the progress of combat training, and said, Listen, Nikolai Ivanovich, and do not we have an instructor methodical training session with the commanders of battalions and companies to fight with German tanks? It is worthwhile, agreed Chief of Staff. Then think over the lesson plan with Naumenko. Nods at me, regimental commander. Tomorrow at 8:00 to report. Major Ponomarev entrusted this case to me, saying at the same time, You and the cards in your hands. You've already seen Nazi tanks in battle, and prepare yourself for the performance in front of the commanders. And here I sit at my staff table, thinking about how best to build a lesson, what I will talk to commanders, many of whom are my fathers, fit my age. I remember again and again my first, although short battles, meetings with enemy tanks. What was characteristic of German tactics? First of all, the desire to act en masse. On the company's defence area usually go out 5 to 7 tanks, and sometimes, and more. The strength of the German tank attack and in its demoralising effect on the defenders. Tanks seem invulnerable. Weak in spirit, untrained, unprepared fighter begins to panic. He already believes in his death. He does not know what to do. how to be. Alas, we suffered heavy losses at first, but we have already begun to learn how to beat the hitherto invincible Panzer Grohmill. It turned out that they are vulnerable, a special weakness in the German machines, their aft part and tracks. Sometimes one grenade was enough to break the track strip. Well, and bottles with a combustible mixture, which our daredevils threw on the stern, made fascist tanks burn with fires. All these considerations and much more I now had to translate into a concrete plan of instructor methodical class. It was not easy. Impressions are first of all emotions, and methodology is a precise calculation of time, means, forces, and possibilities of both trainees and trainees. 2 days later, the class took place. There is no need to describe how it went. I will only say that the regiment commander and the chief of staff were satisfied, and the regiment commissar even praised me. I liked senior political officer Ibragimov very much. I'll tell you more, I admired him. His voice was calm, he spoke with a slight oriental accent. As if now I see his dry, swarthy face and firm look of surprisingly beautiful eyes. They are a strange greenish-brown colour. One of the staff commanders once remarked, "Our commissar has eyes of khaki colour, very military eyes." And since the eyes are the mirror of the soul, we can firmly say that the soul of the commissar of the regiment was a real Bolshevik. Always collected, restrained, concentrated. In all matters he delves kindly and at the same time strictly. One can see at once that he knows a lot, but he puts himself in such a way that he teaches people and at the same time learns from them. I saw Sabik Halilovich in units where he created party and komsomol organizations, talked with fighters, studied their moods and requests, and they always spoke frankly because he had, apparently, an innate ability to communicate with people in confidence. He was able to inspire them with vigour and optimism, so necessary in that difficult time. I remember such a case. At the drill, one of the commanders of the Horns demanded that the Red Army soldiers sang a popular song before the war, the refrain of which sounded like this: "Belorussia native, golden Ukraine. Your young happiness, we will shield it with steel bayonets." So the company did not want to sing this song. The singer started another one, to which Comroti reacted painfully. "Stand down, sing as ordered," and the company went, typing step, and was silent. This scene was observed by the commissar. He called the company commander to himself and said, "You remember one thing. The song is the voice of the soul of the people. It is necessary to understand who and what is now in Belarus and Ukraine. When we liberate them, then we will sing, 'With bayonets, we will protect them.'" The incident, as they say, was over. And a few days after this incident, I had to speak to the soldiers, more in the role of a political officer than an assistant to the chief of staff. I checked the course of training in the machine gun company. And here was a fighter, Lykoman, his last name remembered, very deftly handled his Maxim. I praised him during a smoke break. He answered properly, and then asked, "How come, Comrade Lieutenant, it turned out that the Germans are beating us? For 3 months, in fact, to the quiet Don? What is the reason? As a son of the working people, I want to know." This Lykoman has a bold, even angry look. He's not young, about 40 years old. Other soldiers are standing nearby, waiting to see what I'll say and how I'll answer. "This is a temporary phenomenon, comrades," I said. The fascist attacked suddenly, used the surprise factor, showed treachery. "And it doesn't make me feel any better," Lykoman persisted. "Does my wife Froza or my daughter Varyuka feel better from this temporality? When the Kraut reaches our Stavropol, what will happen to them? I think so. Hitler fooled our government's heads, put our vigilance to sleep, so we are dragging away." And again he looks at us point blank, and you can't understand what is in the man's soul. He speaks like that out of gloating or out of great civilian concern. I decided to give him a sterner answer. "You, Red Army soldier Lykoman, be careful what you say. You must have heard what Comrade Stalin said. The enemy will be defeated, and that's it. We must believe in victory, not panic. You've got the Maxim, but the language, and his tongue is like a Maxim's drummer." The men laughed softly. Lykomen took a quick glance at the wit and immediately said in his own shorthand, "Good fellow countryman, if it's as a percussionist, I don't mind. A percussionist of a machine gun is a necessary and important detail." "Lykomen," I intervened, "stop talking. Once again I repeat to you, we must believe in victory, but we'll break the fascists. Maybe we'll reach Berlin." Red Army soldiers are standing around me, keeping silent, but in the eyes of each of them I see the same question as Lykomen's. Don't I live with the same concern? My fatherland, Ukraine, is already being trampled by the enemy with a digging boot, treading the bread fields with tanks, and my relatives are there, on the other side of the front. So what will I, the commander of the Red Army, panic from this? Never. I know. Victory comes only to those who can direct their will and all their strength to the holy cause of fighting the fascist invaders. The strength will be tripled by concentration and multiplied by hatred of the enemy. It will be multiplied tenfold. And if Comrade Stalin says, "Our cause is right," the enemy will be defeated. Then my understanding of rightness and justice is, first of all, my conviction in the irresistibility of the cause, which was started by the Great October. Do you understand, Comrade Lykomen? What kind of a man are you? You don't look like an alarmist or a provocateur. I expressed these thoughts to the machine gunners, and I finished like this. You, Lykomen, you say the German will roll. Is he rolling so freely? No. From the first day the Red Army has been defending steadfastly. Look at this. At Smolensk the fascists were held off for 2 months. Sevastopol stands heroically. And the further we go, the stronger our blows will be. We are still learning how to fight a real war. Let's, comrades, I turned to everyone, do not guess about whether the German will come to Stavropol or not and learn to fight. It will be more profitable. By the way, the fascist can be beaten. He only declared himself invincible, but in fact drags away if you pin him down. I noticed that the tension in our conversation seemed to have subsided, and that machine gunner, Lykomen's fellow countryman, pushed him with his shoulder. Well, Danila Ilyich, as they say, we'll live, not die. And if we do, we'll die heroically. And why are you sticking to the comrade lieutenant with your questions? He's trying to teach everyone to understand the maneuver, so that tomorrow you won't get killed for stupidity. Understand? Instead of whining, you'd ask your comrade lieutenant to tell you how a German is beaten. He's already fought and even got wounded. I told the men about my first fights, and as if anew I experienced in those minutes and trembling expectation of the fight with the enemy, and felt the acrid and sour smell of smoke from the German shell bursting, and saw a 40-50 shell. And though I had not been at the front for long, the impressions of the war had already entered me deeply. They included fear of a Messer diving at you, of a rumbling tank plunging straight on to the fragile berm of your trench, and they also turned into hatred for Hitlerites, who, covering themselves with armour, trample our land, burn towns and villages, kill, torture, rape my mothers and sisters, Russians, Ukrainians, Belarusians and other Soviet people. For what? For the fact that we lived according to our own Soviet way of life, without landlords, capitalists and other exploiters? That we have created a society of free labour and faith in the high reason of man, unprecedented on earth? That we love this world of socialism created by us? One of my first acquaintances in the regiment was the commander of the 2nd Rifle Company, Senior Lieutenant Pyotr Vasilievich Kiryanov. He was almost 20 years older than me, and grey hair had already silvered his head. During the Civil War, Kiryakov led a detachment of Red paratroopers on an armoured train, fought on the Polish front, crushed the white gangs on the Don, Kuban, Stavropol, then worked in command positions and VCHK and OGPU. Lively, sociable, sturdy, Petr Vasilievich immediately aroused sympathy from people. He loved and knew how to talk about his life, about his friends, with whom he fought on the fronts of the Civil War, willingly shared memories of meetings with Sergei Mironovich Kirov, together with whom he fought in the North Caucasus. The political commander of this company was Viktor Ivanovich Dudnikov, young, medium height, with an unruly bush on his forehead. He and the commander were firm friends, were inseparable, and I liked their comradeship. It was especially valuable in the conditions of war and served as a good example for others. I also got acquainted with the commanders and political officers of other units, the commander of the 1st Rifle Company, Lieutenant Zubarev, the political officer of this unit, Shestopolov, the commander of the 3rd Rifle Company, Lieutenant Zaitz, and political officer Kuznetsov, the commander of the 5th Rifle Company, Lieutenant Burley, the commander of the Mortar Company, Lieutenant Leshchev. Platoon in the regiment were appointed graduates of the Krasnodar Infantry School. All of them had a solid military training. Many of them I also recognized quite well. I would like to say a special word about political officer Georgy Ilarionovich Borozintse. Before mobilization, he worked as a party leader of a large collective farm. He came to the regiment from the first day of formation. For 6 months he was a political officer of the communication company, and then he was elected a part-torg of the regiment. Looking ahead, I note that Borozinets went through the whole war in this position, finished it with the rank of Guards Major and with 4 battle orders on his chest. Georgy Ilarionovich was 10 years older than me. He was already over 30. Everyone in the regiment knew the party leader, both communists and non-partisans, and he seemed to know everyone, sincerely reached out to people, and those reached out to him. In the days of the formation of the regiment military camp on the territory of Bibertova Dacha resembled a huge human anthill. Soldiers were clearing the places for new tents from bushes, removing brushwood and fallen leaves, laying paths, levelling the grounds for formation and drill training. On the main avenue leading to the headquarters building, there were colourfully decorated boards with slogans urging the fighters to study hard and beat the hated enemy. The camp quieted down late in the evening, but in one cabin the lights were often kept on until the morning. I spent the day and night in it. Of course, it was our headquarters, and here I must say warm words to the Chief of Staff, Major N.I. Ponomarev. In his 43 years, he looked young. Nikolai Ivanovich's character was calm. You could easily talk to him, consult with him. Major was extremely attentive to the interlocutor. Often when talking, brown eyes squinted slightly, and thick and wide eyebrows converged at the bridge of the nose. He appreciated a joke and liked to joke himself. Scheduled classes on combat and political training, as a rule, were held in the field, behind the northwestern outskirts of the city. This place was called a roller. Quite a large plain was cleared of stones and bumps overgrown with bushes. We studied from dawn till dark. Of course, it was not easy to learn, but the soldiers and commanders well understood the complexity of the situation and did not spare neither effort nor time for training. On the roller were installed homemade stuffed animals to teach the techniques of bayonet combat, dug trenches, trenches with communication lines. Their broomsticks were camouflaged with turf. Here we practiced firing techniques with various weapons. Fighters learned to throw grenades. One morning I arrived at the firing range, which was equipped former stone quarry. There the 2nd Company was engaged in firearms training. Senior Lieutenant P.V. Kiryakov welcomed me cordially. "And where is the political officer?" I asked. "Checking targets." By the way, a month before the beginning of the war, Dudnikov graduated from the courses of political staff of the Reserve and Buynaksk, shoots well with pistol and rifle. I was drawn to the firing line. VI. Dudnikov came up to me, said hello. "They say that you are almost a sniper," I said. "Well, I'm far from being a sniper," smiled the polytruk. "And I learned to shoot when I served in the army and then in the police, where I worked as a senior instructor of the political department in the regional department. I knew that the regimental commander and the chief of staff would come to the company in the afternoon, and I told Kiryakov and Dugnikov about it. "Well, guests are always welcome," said the company commander. "The bosses, even more so." He left platoon commander Junior Lieutenant Yakovenko to lead the firing, and the three of us went to the tent city. Soon there came Lieutenant Colonel S.D. Vasilkov and Major N.I. Ponomarev. Company commander reported to them on the progress of combat training. "We, Comrade Lieutenant Colonel," said Kiryakov, "formed departments on this principle, that each was either participants in the fighting at Hassan, Khalkhin-Gol, or Red Army soldiers who learned the Soviet-Finnish War. They pass on their experience to those who have not yet served in the army or served long ago. Each such fighter," Dudnikov added, "supervises 2 or 3 comrades. In fact, we now have 2 or even 3 instructors in each squad, not counting the commander. And now they teach the fighters. And they seem to be doing well. And the Red Army soldiers are all trying. They realize that we are preparing for a serious war." "Do you recognize the best?" Vasilkov asked. "We celebrate every day without fail." "Here, look," supported the commander political officer, pointing to a plywood shield nailed to a pole, dug near the tent. On the shield at the top was written, "Death to the German invaders." Below it were 2 sections, on the left, the task of the day, on the right, today's honoured. And even lower, the 3rd section, the content of which was determined by the inscription, "Before the judgment of his comrades, a fighter." There, however, was no surname. "Well, has anyone been before the court of his comrades?" the regiment commander asked. "There was one fighter, Comrade Lieutenant Colonel," answered Dudnikov. "He tried to swipe the government underwear to the left. Then we inspected the tents and the training field." "Here's what, Pyotr Vasilievich," suddenly said Lieutenant Colonel Vasilkov, turning to the company. "There is an idea. It will be necessary to build a bunker in reality and show the soldiers how to storm and destroy such firing points. Will you do it?" "There is to make a bunker," Kiryanov called out clearly. 2 days deadline. And report. And so 2 days passed. Since I was assigned to control the order to build a bunker, I asked Major Ponomarev in the morning to go to the training field to Kiryanov. "Come on," agreed the chief stabber. "Take a horse from the liaisons, but do not linger there." I was not supposed to have my own horse then, as well as other assistants of the chief of staff. If there was a need for horses, we took them from the platoon of mounted reconnaissance, where there were several spare ones, or from the mounted liaison officers who were on duty daily at the headquarters. What to do? They had no time to extend the telephone lines everywhere. The reels with cable and the apparatuses were still being delivered. A dozen minutes later, riding into the company to Kiryakov, I found him for setting the task of storming the bunker to the platoon of Junior Lieutenant Urakin. A squat structure of logs and stones was dug into the ground on a hillock, covered with soil. 3 embrasures could keep the nearby terrain under the crosshairs, reliably controlled the road and the approaches to the hilltop. I approached the breach. The place was well chosen. Every fighter could imagine how difficult it was to approach this firing point under the devastating machine gun bursts. "Please, you can throw up grenades." Kiryakov poked his heel into a boulder on the ceiling of the bunker. "There are 3 piles, and they've also piled up stones. You can't take them easily. So, Urakin, how will you solve the problem?" The skinny junior lieutenant said, "I concentrate the fire of the platoon on the southern and eastern embrasures. Grenade launchers come from the north, there is a groove. We'll get it from there. And I, your enemy, know about that groove. And at 70 meters, who will throw a grenade at you? Think, Urakin, think. The machine gun. It won't let your grenade throwers stick their noses out of the groove." "Eh?" Urakin nervously adjusted his belt buckle, stepped from foot to foot. "I'll put a hand machine gun to suppress the northern embrasure." The commanders spent a few more minutes figuring out the plans of attack, and it suddenly began to seem to me, frankly speaking, that it was not a training task to be solved, but a real bunker. And then I saw the commander's wisdom of the old Chekist, who taught his subordinates to act in conditions as close to combat as possible. Think, Yurikin, take everything into account, where the sun shines from, how the wind blows, what kind of grenades you have, what kind of people, who is your neighbour. This is war. I did not go into the course of the task. Having inspected the bunker, having made sure that everything was done to the best of my ability, I went to the horse. "What do you think, Lieutenant?" Kiryakov called me. "Lieutenant Colonel Vasilkov will come to see the bunker?" "Maybe. I can't say for sure." "Let him come. I'll show him how to cover the bunkers with smoke." Apparently, Komrota had a lot of different solutions to the same problem. He thought quickly, acted resourcefully. This is what I said, without hiding my admiration, Major Ponomarev, when I returned to headquarters and reported on what I had seen. "Uh-huh. Good. Well done. I knew that Pyotr Vasilyevich will not fail," rejoiced Chief of Staff. "In each battalion, Naumenko, do you hear? We need to plan a lesson on the destruction of bazookas. It will come in handy. While the Germans are advancing, we have not to take, but to hold the bazookas," I said. Chief of Staff looked at me mockingly. "Forward should look, Naumenko. Today we are retreating, and tomorrow there will be a holiday on our street, and it is necessary to teach people any kind of fighting." By the end of September 1941, it got colder and it started to rain. The tents became damp and cold, especially at night. On the morning of September 27th, the first snow fell unexpectedly. It was even beautiful. On the yellow-green crowns of oaks white, very delicate shroud glistened under the scanty rays of the sunlight fluffy hoarfrost. On the same day, all the regiment's units were ordered to build dugouts to replace the tents that no longer provided reliable shelter from the weather. The ground had not yet had time to freeze, so the soldiers broke into it quickly. And there was no need to push them. They were trying for themselves. And the next night they slept in the dugouts. It was more cramped there than in the tents, but much warmer. However, the next day the sun began to burn so hot that the snow quickly melted. The weather was warm and windless. We were running out of time. The war was rushing people. The front was waiting for replenishments. The regiment commander appeared more and more often on the training field, often personally led tactical exercises. He was preoccupied with concerns about supplying units with everything necessary, did not give rest, and we, staffers. October 11th, a commission of the headquarters of the North Caucasus Military District, headed by Major General M.I. Kozlov, checked the state of combat readiness of our regiment. The main attention of the inspectors focused on the mastery of soldiers with standard weapons, tactical methods of combat. We learned about the fact that the commission noted the good training of the regiment. We learned from the division commander, Colonel P.I. Chuvashov. Together with the commander and commissar of the regiment, commanders of the regimental staff, he visited after the inspection in the units and talked to people. Approaching a group of soldiers, he asked a Red Army soldier, Golub, "How difficult is military training?" "It is given with sweat, Comrade Colonel. My uniform does not dry out," answered Golub. "But nothing, we will endure. It will be harder at the front." "You understand correctly. Well done," praised the commander, and turned to Red Army man Averin. "And what do you think? Will we defeat the fascists?" "I think so, Comrade Colonel. Our ancestors crushed different conquerors many times, and we also have enough strength and skill to defeat the fascists." "You think right, Comrade Fighter. We will definitely win and cleanse our Soviet land from fascist filth." On October 14th, battalions, as always, early in the morning went to the field for regular training, and in the afternoon all personnel was built at the front line. Everyone already knew that there was a very responsible and solemn moment, taking the military oath, and it was clear to everyone that it meant that the training was finished, and in the near future they would be sent to the front. By the end of a month and a half of training, the soldiers had well mastered the tactics of defensive and offensive combat by day and night, issues of anti-tank defence, hand-to-hand combat techniques, got a good physical conditioning. As a result, the regiment became a fully combat-ready unit, ready to enter into battle with the Nazi invaders. After taking the oath, the regiment commissar addressed the personnel with a brief, excited speech. We, staff commanders, stood next to him and felt how worried senior political officer Ibragimov was. But outwardly he kept calm, spoke about the high responsibility of the war for the defence of the motherland from the enemies, instilled confidence in the soldiers that the victory in the end will be for us. The solemn oath-taking ceremony ended with the presentation of the regiment patron's banner of the Ipatovsky district of Stavropol Krai. Lieutenant Colonel S.D. Vasilkov, taking the banner, went down on his right knee, kissed the edge of the cloth and, rising from hand to hand, passed the flag to the Chief of Staff of the regiment, Major N.I. Ponomarev. From that moment until the receipt of the battle banner, the red banner of the Ipatovs, in fact, replaced it, and the regiment unofficially became known as the Ipatovsky Regiment. And the next day we received the order to send us to the front. Battalion by battalion, on foot, units moved along the central street of Stavropol to the railway station. Echelons for loading people, horses, military equipment and vehicles were brought to the platform. Not wide, but long platform was filled with numerous seeing off, mothers, wives, children of soldiers and commanders, most of whom, as already mentioned, were local residents. And all of them realized that today, perhaps, they were parting with their relatives and friends forever. I saw Senior Lieutenant Kiryakov saying goodbye to his wife and children at one of the wagons. His wife Maria Ivanovna kept shifting from one hand to another a small bundle, apparently intended for Pyotr Vasilievich. She was sobbing quietly, and with the corner of her handkerchief she tried to wipe away her tears discreetly. "Peter, my dear, take care of yourself. Write to us more often. We'll be waiting for your news every day." The grey-haired company commander pressed his son to his chest, stroked his curls, kissed him. "Masha, take care of the children," he said to his wife in a soft, deaf from excitement voice. "They will soon grow up and become your assistants." On the platform appeared the commander and commissar of the regiment, accompanied by the duty officer. They stopped, and the duty officer gave the command, "To the cars!" In different voices it was taken up by the commanders of the units. Over the platform surged crying women. Lauder began to talk, but all this was drowned out by the long horn of the locomotive. The first echelon slowly moved. A forest of hands swayed over the platform, and the voices of the seeing off came in muffled tones. The soldiers smoked in silence. Each of them endured the parting with relatives and friends. In the car, where the regimental headquarters was located, it was cramped, but all the staff equipment, means of communication and boxes with documentation were dispersed so that at the first need, without much difficulty, could be used for their intended purpose. Before sending Echelon's commander and commissar of the regiment received in the division headquarters maps of the combat area, familiarized themselves with the operational situation. The 343rd Rifle Division, which included, in addition to our 1151st Regiment, the 1153rd and 1155th Rifle Regiments, as well as the 903rd Artillery Regiment and other special units, came under the command of the commander of the 56th Army, Lieutenant General F.N. Remezov. It was to defend Rostov-on-Don, to which the 1st Tank Army of Hitler's General Kleist, which was part of the group of fascist armies south, was rushing. The Germans aimed to seize Rostov before the onset of cold weather by all means, and thus provide themselves with the opportunity to further advance to the Caucasus. Late in the evening at the Kavkazskaya junction station, our echelon made a brief stop and then moved on. In the evening, we passed Rostov-on-Don. On the night of October 16, 1941, the echelons stopped at the stations Kopy and Sinyavka, which are located on the section of the railroad between Rostov and Taganrog. Under Rostov and Kharkov, Hitler's military leadership rightly considered Rostov-on-Don as the gate of the Caucasus. That is why our Supreme Command set a task to the troops of the Southern Front, and specifically the 56th Army, to firmly close this gate. The 343rd Infantry Division was ordered to take up the defence in the area of Sinyavka Station and to prevent the breakthrough of enemy tanks and infantry along the highway from Taganrog to Rostov. Our 1151st Rifle Regiment was to ride this highway. Lieutenant Colonel S.D. Vasilkov gathered the commanders in the staff car and explained to us the task. "It is quite possible," he said, frowning, "that we will have to be the first in the division to take on the enemy's blow, and on the most tank-dangerous direction. Therefore, in each department should be allocated from among the most reliable fighters to 2 tank fighters. Unloading of the regiment's personnel was carried out late at night on October 16th. It was cold. In addition, it began to rain. The first thing that people saw was a fire. Railway station Sinyavka was bombed by fascist planes during the day. Station warehouses were burning. One could smell the acrid, bitter odour of burning grain. Crimson flames illuminated broken cars, destroyed station buildings. From the side of Taganrog came the sound of artillery cannonade. Faces of soldiers became stern. They were uncomfortable from this first vision of war. They unloaded quickly. Here and there, muffled words of commands were heard. The men formed into columns, and the units marched off into the dark night. An annoying, tedious rain soaked the ground, and the road up the hill became slippery. Battalions went to the specified area. The platoon of mounted reconnaissance under the command of Junior Lieutenant P.K. Borkut arrived here before the others. After him came the 2nd Rifle Company of Senior Lieutenant P.V. Kiryakov. It was tasked to fulfill the first combat mission, to set up sentries. By this time, the regiment was rearmed with Tokarev semi-automatic rifles, machine guns and hand machine guns, ammunition for them. Each soldier was given 2 grenades and 2 bottles of flammable liquid. By morning, the rain stopped. Soon, field kitchens were smoking in the unit's location, and after a breakfast with hot tea, the soldiers' mood was noticeably lifted. We in the headquarters became aware that our troops are fighting in the area of Taganrog. No one had any doubts. The enemy is really not far away, as well as the time when we will have to meet him head-on. Suddenly, horse carts with the wounded pulled along the highway from the direction of Taganrog. They were overtaken by covered trucks, on which were white circles with red crosses. The day of October 17 began comparatively quietly. The sun sometimes peeped through the foggy, wind-whipped clouds. When the fog cleared, everyone saw that there was an open area ahead. On the right and left of the highway, there were shallow ravines covered with stunted bushes. To the left of the highway, on the hillside, took the defence of the 1st Rifle Battalion. On the very crest of this hill were placed from right to left rifle companies. First, Lieutenant Zubarev, 2nd Senior, Lieutenant Kiryakov, and 3rd, Lieutenant Zaitz. Behind these units, on the slope of the gully, in the bushes, took the position of a battery of 45mm guns under the command of Junior Lieutenant B.D. Radchenko. Behind it settled the command post of the regiment, where we, regimental staffers. To the right of the highway, the positions of the 2nd Rifle Battalion, on the left flank, the 3rd Rifle Battalion. On our left was to take the defence of the 1153rd Rifle Regiment. However, apparently it was delayed on the way, and the division commander Colonel P.I. Chuvashov had to make a forced decision, to stretch our defence to the dead Donets River. So it turned out that the first combat task of our regiment was quite difficult. This is confirmed by the Combat Order No. 1 of the 56th Army on October 17, 1941, with which, of course, I got acquainted only many years later, working on the book. It said, 1. The enemy, having put into action motor mechanised units at Severners on October 17, 1941, broke through the front of the 9th Army at the site of the 31st Infantry Division, and by the afternoon reached Sambek, threatening to reach the approaches to Rostov. 2. 31st Infantry Division, retreating in the eastern direction. 3. The 343rd Infantry Division, which arrived by railroad, From the march took up the defence on the site. Kolkozny to the Mrtvyi Donets River, and by the beginning of the enemy's attack, occupied only one regiment of the entire front of the division. Suddenly a loud "Air!" suddenly cut everyone's ears. This word swept across the entire defence line. People stopped digging trenches, raised their heads, looking into the sky, anxiously listening. Far in the west, just above the horizon, showed black dots, which, rapidly approaching, increasing in size, and at the same time the rumble of engines was growing more and more clearly. From the CP was clearly visible, as a series of ruptures, one after another, surged up the slope of the ravine, where the positions of the 2nd Battalion. The first casualties appeared in the regiment. With this began our baptism of fire. Through the lines of trenches began to advance fighters of the surviving units of the 31st Division. Around noon at the control room was a telephone conversation between Lieutenant Colonel S.D. Vasilkov and the commander. Colonel P.I. Chuvashov was interested in the situation, fighting and morale of fighters and commanders. Regimental commander reported, "Bombing. The enemy is accumulating in 1.5 kilometres to the left and right of the highway. Pulled up tanks, observed about 50 units. The remnants of the 31st Division are passing through the battle lines." "How? They're coming through?" "Yes, they should hold until 15:00. For a minute the division commander was silent, apparently deciding something, and then he said something that made Sergei Dmitrievich's face stretch. He still managed to whisper to us, standing next to him, "The commander is on the wire." The loud, bassy voice of Lieutenant General F.N. Remezov was heard from the telephone receiver. "Comrade Vasilkov, I order. All of the 31st who has not yet passed to keep. I repeat, all of them. Is it clear to you that the regiment is holding the defence for the whole division until the approach of others? Stand to the death. Is that clear?" "Yes, Comrade Commander, apparently believing that in front of them only retreating parts of the Soviet troops, Hitlerites under the cover of tanks were approaching our trenches in shifts. They were climbing until machine gunners' fire pinned them to the ground. When they came to their senses, they unleashed a barrage of mortar and artillery fire on the regiment's defences. The entire front line of trenches boiled with bursts, especially in the 1st Battalion section. For several minutes the hillside could not be seen. Everything was covered with smoke. A battery of the 903rd Artillery Regiment entered the battle. Then the Nazis changed tactics, went to the right and left, intending to break through the line of our defences from the flanks. Tanks had not yet reached the trenches, but already several vehicles were hit. Some were burning, others stopped. The first enemy attack was repulsed. Finally began to approach the battalions of the 1153rd Rifle Regiment of Major M.I. Potievsky. The regiment commander spent 5 minutes at our CP, clarified the situation. "It's hot here, Sergei Dmitrievich," he said to Vasilkov. "It will be hot. The regiment holds the front of the whole division. The first enemy attack, as I said, was repulsed. But with great losses for us, they were especially tangible in the 1st Battalion. Here the regimental commander ordered to transfer 1 rifle platoon from the 3rd Battalion, 3 machine gun crews and a mortar platoon. "Come on, Namenko, and you go there," ordered me Lieutenant Colonel. "You will help the commander with advice in case of anything. Probably soon the Germans will come again." I got to the battalion CP, told the commander that I would go to the 2nd Company, to Kiryakov. Political officer Dudnikov came out of the message line to meet me. "Have you received reinforcements?" I asked him. "We received a machine gun crew. Kiryakov is just now determining the firing position for him on the right flank. Company commander correctly assessed the situation, reinforcing the right flank machine gun, and he chose a good position for the Maxim on a hill, from which the approaches to the company's defence were well viewed and shot. I immediately determined this by approaching the 2 machine gunners. They, wielding shovels, were deepening the trench, levelling the bunker. "Hello, Comrade Lieutenant," one of them suddenly addressed me. "I managed to see you again. Red Army man Likoman is the commander, and he put his hand to his hat, which had been shifted to the back of his head. Don't you recognize him? I immediately recognized in him that very insistent fighter who in the training field in Stavropol 2 weeks ago pestered me with questions during a conversation with machine gunners. "Hello, Comrade Likoman," I answered. "I remember you. And you were shooting great then. You haven't forgotten how to shoot?" "The battle will show, Comrade Lieutenant." And then the Nazis went on the attack again. Their cannons and mortars started hitting again. Our trenches were also bristling with fire. But for some reason, Likoman's Maxim was silent. Kiryakov got worried and sent a contact to him. "What happened?" asked the fighter. "I'm waiting for the Krauts to come closer," answered the machine gunner. Showing enviable restraint, Danila Likoman pressed the machine gun trigger at the moment when the chain of figures in grey-green overcoats rose in height. He was firing accurately. I noticed how many of the attacking Germans fell to the ground and did not get up. When a group of fascists did break through to the front line, grenades went into action. Enemy mortars and guns opened fire again. Trenches and trenches in many places were blocked by shelling. From bursts of bombs, shells and mines, it was difficult to breathe. Suddenly someone shouted, "The commander was killed!" I looked back at the voice and saw Kiryakov lying in the trench, half covered with earth. He was killed by a fragment of an enemy shell that had exploded nearby. That's how Pyotr Vasilievich died on the first day of the battle. He went through the whole civil war, and here. Political officer, V.E. Dudnikov took command of the company. On the same day was mortally wounded and machine gunner Danila Likoman. His wife Frosya did not wait for him. But I learned about it later, being in the regiment headquarters, where I was informed about combat losses. The spearhead of another attack of Hitlerites had to the junction of 1151st and 1153rd regiments. The Germans threw there up to 20 tanks, 10 of which broke through the fighting order and began to go to the rear of our regiment. It was a critical moment. The CP realized that now decides the fate of the battle. "Well, gunners, on you all hope," exclaimed Lieutenant Colonel Vasilkov, giving orders to the commander of the battery of 45 mm cannons, Junior Lieutenant Radchenko, and the commander of the battery of 76 mm guns, Senior Lieutenant Kostin, to destroy the tanks that had broken through. Under mortar and artillery fire, the calculations were deployed. The guns were put on direct aim. The horse drivers took the horses. The German tankers probably did not fear a meeting with our battery and went without special precautions. From the regiment's CP, it was seen how the Nazi tanks divided into 2 groups. One of them moved to Kostin's battery, the other towards the 40. The artillerymen opened fire. The tanks responded with shots from their guns. In our calculations appeared killed and wounded. At one gun, only the loader Ivan Voloshin was left. For the gunner to the panorama stood Junior Lieutenant I.D. Radchenko. 3 enemy vehicles were coming to the 40-50. Radchenko broke the caterpillar of the lead tank with a precise fire, and it turned on the spot, and the other 2 turned back. The battery of 40 tanks shot down 4 German tanks in this battle. And the first in the regiment Junior Lieutenant, Iosif Davidovich Radchenko, was awarded then the Medal for Bravery. At the time when Radchenko's battery was repelling a tank attack, fascist shells one after another were tearing at the positions of the 76 mm battery. There were fewer and fewer men left at the guns. Senior Lieutenant Konstantin Dmitrievich Kostin also justified the hopes of the regiment commander. Calculations of his battery destroyed 2 tanks. We lost a lot of soldiers and commanders on that hard day for us. The commander of the 3rd Battalion, Senior Lieutenant Abramov, the commander of the machine gun company, Lieutenant Rodionov, the platoon commander, Lieutenant Grach, Red Army soldiers Shliakov, Kosherga, Chebotarev, Koval, died heroically. With the onset of darkness, units of the regiment were moved to the area of the large village of Chaltir, where they took a new line of defence. After the night rain in the freshly dug trenches was damp and dank. Raindrops glistened on the stale grass. A sharp wind drove low, dark clouds almost overhead. The sky was beginning to lighten in the east, but no one had slept a wink during the night. There was no time to sleep. People were completing earthworks, adjusting bunkers, arranging niches for ammunition. We at the new CP did not sleep either. When the regiment moves to another place, occupies a new area of defence in anticipation of enemy attacks, the staff commanders also have a lot of things to do. It was barely morning when a shell whistled over our heads, howling. True, it exploded far behind the CP, but 2 other shells came closer. We could clearly hear how shrill the shrapnel was, screeching through the air. The wind pulled dark plumes of smoke over the steppe. At the regimental headquarters, it became known that the enemy was attacking our right flank. From there we already heard frequent machine gun and machine gun bursts, grenade bursts. Hitlerites cut into our defence and surrounded the 1st Rifle Company of Lieutenant A.P. Zubarev. The regiment commander ordered political officer V.I. Dudnikov and his company. Dudnikov with his company, to counterattack the Germans from the flank, and the Nazis were thrown back behind the front line. In this battle distinguished a group of soldiers of the 1st Company led by Petty Officer P.I. Shelkopyasov. The brave communist several times raised his soldiers in counterattacks, persistently destroying the enemies, but during one of them and himself fell to the death of the brave. Towards evening a fog began to roll in from the Azov Sea. It was coming as a dense, cloudy grey wall, covering first the German positions and then ours. Even the shots began to sound less and less often. The night passed quietly, but as soon as dawn came, the fascists resumed their attacks. In this and other days the regiment fought hard, but firmly held its positions. In this we were strongly helped by the Marine Brigade, which arrived at the neighbouring defence area. When a week of our stay at the front had passed, the first results of the regiment's combat activity began to emerge in general outlines. The soldiers in their majority fought courageously. Communists and Komsomol members by personal example carried others away, setting examples of fearlessness. The most reliable source of information about the feats of arms was our part-torg of the regiment Politruk I, Antonenko, an experienced party worker and a great man of heart. He always had information about communists, Komsomol members and non-party members who distinguished themselves in battles. Communist Sergeant Nikolenko, commander of the 4th Rifle Company, was given the task to destroy 2 enemy firing points. Having correctly assessed the situation, he and his squad went into the flank of the Hitlerites. In a hot hand-to-hand fight, our soldiers defeated the enemy, capturing 2 enemy machine guns. Once the fascists tried to surround the 7th Company of the Communist Lieutenant Punev. The situation during the battle became sharper and more tense, but the company commander was not confused, confidently and decisively led his unit. During the fierce battle, which lasted a whole day, the mortar gunner Komsomolets Anton Uvarov destroyed 2 machine gun crews and 1 mortar of the enemy. And when our company went into a counterattack, he performed a feat for which he was awarded the Medal for Bravery. And the case was like this: 1 enemy machine gun was beating with flank fire and did not allow our fighters to move forward. By this time Uvarov's mortar was out of action, and the commander ordered him to destroy the enemy's firing point with grenades. Clinging tightly to the ground, Uvarov crawled to the hillside from where the enemy machine gunner was firing. Having reached a wide bush of grass, Uvarov looked around and moved even closer without noise. Now he could clearly see the Hitlerite, who, carried away by the shooting, had not noticed him. Uvarov threw a grenade, and the machine gun fell silent. But at that moment 3 fascists pounced on the brave warrior. Uvarov was not confused. In the unequal fight he came out victorious. 2 of them were killed, and the 3rd simply ran away. True, Uvarov himself was wounded in the leg, but he did not leave the battlefield. Honoured in the first battle's company, commanders Zayats and Burley applied for admission to the ranks of the All-Union Communist Party. In one of the battles was twice wounded Politruk Dudnikov. Red Army men Averin and Golub saw that the life of the company commander in danger, rushed to his aid. They bandaged his arm above the wound, cut his blood-filled right boot, took it off and bandaged his leg, then carried the wounded man to the Sanerota. At the front, time has a different dimension than in the rear. It flows faster and is measured not by the number of evening sunsets and morning dawns, but by the number of repulsed enemy attacks and our counter-attacks, if he cut into our positions, and for us, the commanders of the regimental headquarters, and the number of combat reports sent to the division headquarters, and funerals for the dead. That's how 3 weeks ran until November 7th, our national holiday. In all units of the regiment, commanders and political workers held brief rallies in connection with the 24th anniversary of the Great October Socialist Revolution. A lot of joy was brought by the gifts received on this day from the workers and collective farmers of Rostov region, from Rostov Regional Committee of the All-Union Communist Party and Regional Executive Committee. Soldiers and commanders from the heart thanked the Soviet workers who showed care for them. Even Voloshin said very well at the rally in the battery of the 40-fingered soldiers. These gifts once again vividly testify to the fact that the army and the people are one. We, of course, knew that the Red Army was fighting hard near Moscow, holding back the onslaught of the enemy, who dreamed of capturing the capital of our motherland by this day. And that's why they were unspeakably happy to learn that on Red Square, as always, on November 7th, there was a parade of Soviet troops. It means that Moscow is firmly held. It means that the fighting spirit of its defenders and all our people is not broken. The soldiers were burning with the desire to avenge the fascists for their atrocities on our land, and the proof of this was the successful actions of the regiment in the battles northwest of Novokrimskaya, where we withdrew. By order of the division commander, the regiment conducted another reconnaissance by combat. It was carried out by the 2nd Rifle Battalion of Senior Lieutenant F.F. Andreev. Its task was not easy, to seize a dominant height with 5 mounds. Together with the units of the battalion after a short artillery attack in the offensive, went and 2 groups of scouts to capture the language. Riflemen of the 5th Company under the command of Lieutenant Berlil confidently overcame the slope of the height. But when there were no more than 50 metres to the top, a group of enemy machine gunners, hiding among the rocks, began to fire on our fighters. Then, cleverly using the folds of the terrain, moved forward one of the most accurate shooters of the company, Red Army soldier K. Bashkatov. In a few minutes he killed 5 Hitlerites with his rifle with telescopic sight, and with a loud cry, "For the motherland!" rushed forward. Behind him rose his battle comrades. The enemy trembled, began to retreat. With a swift rush, the soldiers took the height. Sniper Karp Vasilievich Bashkatov, who killed dozens of fascists, died a death of the brave in this hot battle. Having taken possession of the height with 5 mounds, our regiment improved its positions, getting the opportunity to view the enemy's battle orders to their full tactical depth. The scouts also successfully accomplished their combat task, managing to take a prisoner who gave valuable information. It became known that the Germans would soon go on the offensive to capture Rostov-on-Don. And indeed, on November 17th, Hitler's command, not counting losses, threw large forces of infantry and tanks in the offensive on Rostov. On November 19th, the fascists broke into its outskirts. On November 23rd, they captured the city. Parts of the 50th Army were forced to withdraw behind the Don River. Our regiment steadfastly held the defence in the Chaltya direction, fulfilling the task to prevent the breakthrough of enemy tanks to the city from the west, but found itself, like the whole 343rd Division, cut off from operating crossings across the Don. By order of the army commander, the division withdrew to the area of Nizhne Gnilovskaya village, where it crossed to the left bank of the Don. Events on the southern front were unfolding in the meantime, according to the plan planned by the Soviet command. By the morning of November 25th, units of the 56th Army were in readiness for an offensive to liberate Rostov-on-Don. In the 343rd Infantry Division were created assault battalions, which were the first to force the Don, break into the city and provide a crossing for the main forces. I suggested to the Chief of Staff of the regiment that our assault battalion was headed by Lieutenant F.P. Pismensky, who had shown himself well in previous battles. Major reported this to Lieutenant Colonel S.D. Vasilkov, and he agreed with the opinion of the staff. By the morning of November 27th, assault battalions moved to the initial position for the attack. The water in the Don and its channels had just frozen. Thin ice barely allowed the movement of infantry on it, completely excluding the crossing of artillery. We naturally realized that it would be difficult for the soldiers to dislodge the enemy from the coastal positions, not having in the battle order of the infantry escort guns, which would destroy targets that were not suppressed during the artillery preparation. But what to do? At 6 Gauss, the artillery preparation began. Exactly 1 hour later, the assault battalions began to force the DOP. Assault battalion of our regiment went first in the division. I could see from the CP, located on a hill on the left bank, how in the pre-dawn twilight the soldiers ran along the ice. True, many of them slipped and fell, but immediately got up and continued to rush forward. About an hour later, Lieutenant Pismensky reported by telephone to the CP that the first trench on the other side of the Don had been cleared of the enemy. It was already dawning when the main forces of the regiment, 2 battalions, began the crossing, and the artillery transferred the fire deep into the German defence. Gradually the fighting moved to the streets of the village of Nizhne Gnilovskaya, and then to the streets of the city. 1 rifle and 1 cavalry division of the 9th Army and 5 rifle divisions and 2 rifle brigades of our 56th Army took part in the liberation of Rostov-on-Don. Almost 3 days there were fierce street battles, and only on November 29th the Nazis were knocked out of Rostov and began to withdraw to the west. As a result of the offensive of our troops, the German fascist invaders were pushed back from the city on 60-80 kilometres in the western direction. It was the first major offensive operation of the Red Army in the Great Patriotic War. In the battles for the liberation of Rostov-on-Don, many soldiers, commanders and political workers of our regiment distinguished themselves. Bravely acted, for example, machine gunner Sem Gozhulia. On one of the streets, the way of our fighters was blocked by the fire of the enemy machine gun installed in the attic of a 4-story house. Red Army man. Gozhulia sneaked into the attic and destroyed the machine gun crew with a grenade. Here I can't but tell about the only woman political commander in our regiment, and, perhaps, in the whole 343rd Rifle Division Alexandra Bakadze. It happened on November 28th. The machine gun company, in which Sasha was a political instructor, was advancing with battles along one of the city streets. Suddenly one of the bunkers, which seemed to be destroyed, came to life. From its embrasures whipped a jet of fire. The company lay down, in the ranks of fighters, confusion, and at this critical moment of the battle stood up in full height and with the cry, "For the motherland, hurrah!" ran forward. Red Army soldiers rushed after her. The company bypassed the bunker and continued the offensive. But the brave girl died. For this feat in January 1942, she was posthumously awarded the Order of the Red Star. At that time I knew nothing about Sasha Bakadze, except that she was a student of the Lenin Military Political Academy. Our regiment commissar, senior political officer Ibragimov, once told me that the political department of the 56th Army wanted to appoint her head of the club of one of the regiments of the 343rd Division. But she categorically refused and asked to be sent as a political officer to the company, to the front line. Sasha was assigned to our regiment as a political commander of a machine gun company. At the beginning of 1986, Viktor Ivanovich Dudnikov brought me in Moscow a small book by Mikhail Andriasov, Consider Me Alive, published a year earlier by Rostov Book Publishing House. This book contains an essay, Daughter of Abkhazia, about Alexandra Bakadze. She spent her childhood in the village of Otkari, Gudauta district of Abkhazia. There she graduated from school, worked as a pioneer counsellor, librarian. As an active Komsomol member, in 1930 she was sent to study at Sukhumi Sovpart School, where Sasha became a communist. Then she studied at the Sopart School in Kutaisi, at the Communist University of Workers of the East in Moscow, worked as an instructor of the Abkhazian Regional Committee of the Communist Party of Georgia, on the recommendation of which she entered the courses at the Military Political Academy named after Lenin. At the beginning of the war, she finished them. One of the streets of Rostov-on-Don now bears the name of Alexandra Bakadze. There is an obelisk on the bank of the Don in memory of her feat. Famous Abkhazian poet Ivan Torba dedicated a poem to her. It contains the following lines: "Quiet Don sparkles with a wave. The quiet Don is always silent. Only a song strives in the distance about the survived years. The obelisk is white, the vastness and steppe around it. To a brave Abkhazian girl, it was erected here. The majestic shore of the Don River sheltered you forever. Proud of your immortal glory, quiet Don, like a man. In the battles for Rostov, the fame of another girl of our regiment, Komsomol girl sanitary instructor, Maria Kukarskaya. She carried 80 wounded soldiers and commanders from the battlefield. In the battles for Rostov, many of our comrades in arms were killed, many were wounded, including the Chief of Staff, Major N.I. Ponomarev. With sadness, I parted with Nikolai Ivanovich before sending him to the hospital. This knowledgeable and energetic staff commander taught me a lot. In his place was appointed Senior Lieutenant V.V. Stepanov, but less than a month he fulfilled this position. December 4th, died. On November 30th, the regiment, conducting offensive battles, approached familiar places in the area of Chaltir, Kopi, and on December 1st, not meeting strong enemy resistance, was already near the station Sinyavka. By the evening of December 2nd, the regiment reached the eastern bank of the Meuse River, where it occupied a new line of defence. On January 8, 1942, I was awarded the next military rank of Senior Lieutenant. I had to take off from overcoat buttonholes 4 cubes faced with red enamel still pre-war factory production, and 2 of them to add to the buttonholes of the uniform. But there was nothing to attach to the buttonholes of the overcoat. There was no military store nearby. The gunsmith petty officer Kliuev, whom everyone at the regimental headquarters called by his name and patronymic, Mikhail Ivanovich, because he was much older than us, helped us out. The petty officer made 6 kuberets from a brass casing and handed them to me with the words, "Wear them for your health, comrade senior lieutenant. God willing, I'll make sleepers for you when you become a captain." But the most significant for me event of those days was another. At the regimental party meeting, I was accepted as a member of the All-Union Communist Party. The regiment commander, Lieutenant Colonel S.D. Vasilkov, the Commissar Senior Political Officer S.X. Ibragimov, and the Partorg Regiment Political Officer I. Antonenko vouch for me, giving recommendations. And the party card was handed to me by the head of the political department of the 343rd Infantry Division Battalion Commissar A.K. Tkachenko. After the death of Senior Lieutenant Stepanov, I was appointed Chief of Staff of the regiment. Things and worries, of course, increased. But I was not afraid of work. 4 months in the position of Chief of Staff taught me a lot. But my promotion was overshadowed by a heavy loss for all of us. Lieutenant Colonel Sergei Dmitrievich Vasilkov, the regiment commander, died like a soldier at a battle post. Coming from a working family, he devoted his entire conscious life to the cause of serving the working class. As a 17-year-old boy, Vasilkov joined the Red Guards and defended the freedom and independence of the young Soviet Republic with a weapon in his hands. From 1919 to 1921, he was in Lenin's personal guard. During the years of service in the Red Army, he repeatedly performed the most important tasks of the command, showing bravery, courage, initiative, was twice wounded in battle. Major I.F. Kilchevsky, who had previously commanded the 1155th Rifle Regiment of our division, was appointed the new regiment commander. The most joyful event in December for us, the frontline soldiers, as well as for all Soviet people, was, of course, the Red Army counter-offensive near Moscow, which began on December 5th. It lasted more than a month, and every day we heard on the radio, learned from newspapers more and more new names of villages and towns near Moscow, liberated from the enemy, and on December 16th, the Nazis were knocked out of Kalinin, over which again rose the red Soviet flag. All of us admired the firmness and courage of the defenders of the capital, who managed to throw back the Nazis from its suburbs beyond the Moscow region. On our section of the front, the enemy, strongly fortified on the western bank of the Mius River, did not take active actions until the end of December, limiting himself to rare artillery, mortar and rifle gun fire, sometimes conducting reconnaissance overflights of our positions by single planes. The 343rd Infantry Division met the new year of 1942, holding its positions on the line Kurlatskaya, Abramovka. I remember that those last days of December and the first days of January were unusually strong for those places, frosts with frequent snowfalls and blizzards. But we were warm not only because we all received good winter uniforms. We were also warmed by the warmth of our dear fellow countrymen from Stavropol, who sent the regiment a New Year's greeting letter. "Know, battle comrades," said the letter, "that all our deeds and thoughts are always together with you. Every Stavropol resident is selflessly working at his post and at any moment with a weapon in his hands is ready to go to the front to defend the socialist fatherland together with you to the last drop of blood." It was further reported that the former Red Partisans and Red Guards of Stavropol, Terek and Kuban, called on the workers of the region to create a volunteer cavalry division to be sent to the front. The people of Stavropol, as is known, fulfilled their promise. Cavalry units of Terek and Kuban Cossacks of older and younger generations joined the 2nd Cavalry Corps of Major General L. M. Dovator, who died heroically near Moscow on December 19th, and was posthumously awarded the title of Hero of the Soviet Union. And from newspapers and radio programs, we were already aware of the daring raids of Dovator's cavalry on the enemy's rear. Fearless warriors firmly crushed the Nazi invaders. On January 6, 1942, the 343rd Infantry Division was ordered to transfer its defence line to another unit and relocate to Rostov-on-Don for additional manning. However, already in the second half of January, the new order abruptly changed very short, more or less calm, without explosions and shots, even unusual for frontline soldiers' rear life. The division was urgently transferred by railroad echelons to the station Kuchemovka. From there, without delay, Mum made a march to the area of Balakleya, northwest of the city of Izium, and the division joined the 6th Army. The command staff of the regiment knew what dictated such a development of events. The defeat of the Germans near Moscow, Tikhvin, and a little earlier near Rostov created favourable conditions for the Soviet offensive in the south. The command of the southwestern direction, with the approval of the Supreme High Command, began regrouping the forces, concentrating them on the distant approaches to Kharkov. In January, February, it was planned to carry out a number of offensive operations, using in them completed units and formations with combat experience. At the end of January, our regiment took the defence at the line of Krasnaya Guzarovka, Collective Farm 1st May, Shurovka. It coincided with the publication of the decree of the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet of the USSR on awarding a large group of Soviet soldiers and commanders for the exemplary performance of combat missions of the command at the front line of the fight against the German invaders and the valour and courage shown. Among them were our soldiers. The Order of the Red Banner was awarded to the battalion commander Lieutenant F. P. Pismensky. The Order of the Red Star, Regiment Commissar S. X. Ibragimov, who was recently awarded the military rank of Battalion Commissar, the Medal for Bravery, Lieutenant A.S. Dautov, Red Army men, V.P. Litvinov, and Uvarov, and others. The situation was tense. Not a single day was not without skirmishes with the enemy, without a firefight or an artillery duel. Repulsing enemy attacks, we ourselves often went into counterattacks. Now to me, as Chief of Staff of the regiment, all the information from the units about the fighting, So I was always aware of events and knew about all the distinguished in battles with the enemy fighters, commanders, political workers. The armoured gunners of the regiment deserved high praise. We have seen with our own eyes that Soviet anti-tank guns, an effective tool in the fight against enemy tanks. Lieutenant P. Ovchinnikov skillfully commanded the company of anti-tank guns. Each armoured gunner perfectly knew the weak, vulnerable places of enemy tanks. Especially distinguished in these battles, Red Army Danilevsky, Berezovsky, Gusainov, Kovrishkin. On their account, there were several enemy vehicles shot down. 5 days almost without breaks, there were fights. Hitlerites fiercely resisted. Some settlements more than once passed from hand to hand. At storming of Kisely Vileg, the 1st Rifle Battalion was in a difficult situation. 2 battalions of enemy infantry, supported by tanks, attacked it in the flank. But the commander Nikolai Abukov, only the other day received the rank of senior lieutenant, was not confused. He quickly deployed the companies and himself struck in the flank of the Hitlerites, which was a complete surprise for them. Taking advantage of the confusion of the fascists, the soldiers broke into the village and, without giving the enemy a moment's hesitation, seized its northern outskirts. Then the regiment was assigned the task to advance to the northeast, to reach the right bank of the Seversky Donets, and to liberate the settlement of Gayevka. Battalions concentrated in Ploskoye Tract. The soldiers lay down in the deep snow, and the frost hit 30 degrees. And only we were about to move forward, as in the sky appeared a dozen German dive bombers, U-87. With howling, they steeply dived, dropped bombs, went into horizontal flight at 200, 300 metres from the ground and poured us with machine guns. True, the pilots were firing more for intimidation and dropped bombs not particularly accurately, so the losses in the regiment were relatively small. We were attacking Gayevka without tank support, and there was no air support at that time. The Katyusha Division fired several salvos at this village, the 903rd Artillery Regiment batteries, and our regimental artillerymen fired, and the battalions went on the attack. They overcame the river on the ice and broke into Gayevka. It was in the middle of the day, and by evening the whole settlement was already in our hands. Soldiers and commanders settled in the surviving houses, escaping from the frost. But then it turned out that the wagon with food was missing. 2 days ago, a petty officer of the communications company FF Meteora left for the divisional food store and disappeared like in water. And only close to midnight he fell into the room where the regimental commissar and I, a completely stiffened petty officer. "Comrade Commissar, the transport has arrived," he reported in a cold bass. "I apologize for the delay, but we had a misfortune on the way." "Aye, Fyodor Fedorovich, how badly everything has turned out for you," Sabir Kalilovich lamented. "The soldiers have been out in the cold and hungry for 2 days, and you are wandering somewhere." "We were already returning to the regiment, Comrade Commissar, and then Junkers bombed the transport. The wagons were in pieces, the horses were killed, and I and 2 of the men were left. We had to get on foot to the division storehouse. There we equipped a new wagon. In those days I had to take a direct part in the battle, and it happened like this. Hitlerites settled in a small farm Tsibika, and several attempts of one of the companies to take this important in tactical respect stronghold were unsuccessful, and they lost a lot of men. And after another unsuccessful attack, which ended when it was already getting dark, I proposed to the battalion commissar Ibragimov my plan of capturing the farm, to put on 5 tanks attached to the regiment, a troop of machine gunners, and attack the Germans at night along the ravine, approaching almost closely to Tsibika. On our side, speed and surprise, I convinced the commissar. Besides, the Germans do not like to fight at night. "Well, Yura," said to me Sabir Halilovich, "your initiative, you and act. At night I, with 3 dozen machine gunners, went to the tankers. We put on white coats. I agreed with the commander of the tankers on the order of action, distributed the machine gunners on the cars. We set off on the road. The moon was shining weakly from behind the clouds, and when our small column approached the farm, We could orient ourselves and chart the further paths of the tanks with paratroopers. As expected, our night attack was a complete surprise for the Germans. The tankers opened fire from cannons and machine guns. We, from automatic rifles, and the fascists, having lost more than 30 people killed, left Tsibiha. A few days later, Viktor Ivanovich Dudnikov, who was wounded, if the reader remembers, in the November battles near Rostov, knocked and came into the hut where the Commissar and I were having breakfast. "Comrade Battalion Commissar," he reported, "Political Officer Dudnikov, after being cured in the hospital, arrived for further service. Sit down, Viktor Ivanovich. Have a refreshment with us together," Ibragimov invited him. "Where did they fix you up?" "In Stavropol Hospital. I'm very glad that I managed to return to my native regiment again." "Where will we assign him, Chief of Staff?" "There are political officers in the rifle companies, but the transport company has no political officer or commander. I'll report my opinion to the regiment commander, to appoint you, Viktor Ivanovich, as political officer of the transport company, and until the company commander arrives, you'll be in charge of him. Do you mind, Nachstaba?" "No, of course not. Dudnikov told us at breakfast about how Stavropol lives, how toilers of the region help the front." "Tomorrow we'll gather platoon agitators," the Commissar told Dudnikov. "Tell them about it. And now go take the company." A week before the 24th anniversary of the Red Army, after several days of hot fighting, the 1151st Rifle Regiment finally knocked out the Nazis from the village of Nizhny Beshkin. The enemy perfectly understood what great importance had this settlement, which was at the crossroads, and therefore fought fiercely for it. But the onslaught of our fighters was unstoppable. In operational reports on the battles for this village, which were compiled in the headquarters, most often mentioned the name of Lieutenant N.D. Abakov, commander of the 1st Battalion. And it was not by chance. Initiative, energetic young commander boldly led fighters in attacks. Endowed by nature savvy, resourcefulness, quick reaction, Nicholas was able to find the right way out of the most difficult situations. The soldiers of his battalion in the regiment were called briefly and expressively Abukovtsi. They were proud of this, and with great respect for their commander, a man of strong will, unparalleled courage. The soldiers loved him for the fact that in difficult front conditions he showed them fatherly care, was able to instill in them vigour and confidence in their abilities. And I really liked Nikolai Abukhov, a dense, stout man, with a handsome face, a little curly-haired, with a charming smile and an invariable pipe in his teeth. At night, Abukhov's battalion went into a ravine on the outskirts of the village to make a sudden flank attack on the enemy. However, the enemy managed to notice the movement of our fighters, and he opened fire on them from residential houses. The way out was self-evident, to attack those houses in which Hitlerites were settled. That was the decision made by the commander. Using the darkness, the soldiers stealthily approached the buildings. Grenades flew into the windows. Together with the commander, inspiring the soldiers, the commissar of the battalion political officer, D.N. Likvari, acted skillfully. In the battle for the village of Nizhny Beshkin, more than 100 Hitler's soldiers were destroyed. 10 soldiers and officers were taken prisoner. Among military trophies there were 6 machine guns and hand machine guns, 2 mortars, 53 mines, 20 shells, over 5,000 cartridges, 2 wagons and a whole warehouse with ammunition. On the eve of the Red Army Day, looking through the next issue of our divisional newspaper Heroic Campaign, I noticed a small note, Letter to a Fighter, the first lines of which interested me and made me strain my memory. Our fighter T. Kolodny P.M. keeps in constant touch with his fellow countrymen. In one of his letters, he assured them that he would bravely and mercilessly crush fascist rapists, ruining our towns and villages. Railroad workers, where the head of the distance, Track T. Ermashov, sent a letter in reply. "Good afternoon, Comrade Kolodny," they wrote. "We received your letter and we are very glad that you are alive and well. skillfully and courageously defending your native land. We promise that here, in the rear, we will be worthy of you." Isn't that Peter Kolodny, I thought, about whom I was asked by a blonde girl in Stavropol in September 1941, when I was walking from the division headquarters to the regiment? I shared my guess with Sabir Khalilovich Ibragimov. "Well, it is quite possible that it is him," said the commissar of the regiment. "He came from Stavropol. He is a good communist and a fighter. I know him well since he is acting as a company political officer. I am thinking of sending a submission to the political department of the division, so that he would be appointed to this position by order. Looking ahead a little, I will say that in March the order of the commander of the 6th Army came to the regiment about the appointment of Pyotr Makarovich Kolodny as a political officer of the 4th Rifle Company of the 1151st Rifle Regiment. But it happens so in the war. Literally 3 days after the order was announced to him, he died. And I painfully thought then, signing his funeral, what a terrible blow befell Pyotr Makarovich's family, his wife and 3 daughters. At the beginning of March, an order was received from the 6th Army headquarters to prepare for the upcoming offensive battles. Rallies, party and Komsomol meetings were held in the units. In close contact with the command-acted party organization of the regiment, headed by political officer G.I. Borozents, who replaced the retired Antonenko wounded. April 22nd, by order of the commander of the 6th Army 343rd Rifle Division, began the transfer of its defensive positions to another unit. We met the May Day holiday in a new place, in the area of Bugayevka, Kharkov region, having entered the reserve of the commander of the Southwestern Front. Here there were no bullets buzzing over our heads, no shells whistling. At the same time, with additional staffing and replenishment of combat equipment in the regiment, there were combat training sessions. Commanders realized and consolidated the accumulated combat experience. The regiment settled in a village with a wonderful song name, Zeleny Gai, 100 and a little kilometers southeast of Kharkov. We all understood perfectly well that we would not stay here for a long time, and as soon as the roads dried up, the lushly blossoming gardens bloomed, the fickle spring weather became more stable. We had to join the busy front life again. Here we received a significant replenishment, several marching companies that arrived from the Central Asian republics. Soldiers came strong, hardy. But many of them did not speak Russian well and therefore did not have time to master the training program along with everyone else. In this connection, the headquarters of the regiment had to make adjustments to the training plans, to introduce additional classes on mastering the spoken Russian language for soldiers of other nationalities. On May 17th, the enemy launched an offensive from the area of Kramatorsk, Slavyansk against the 9th and 57th Armies of the Southern Front. Due to the enemy advance along the river Seversky Donets, there was a threat of encirclement of the Soviet troops operating on the Barvenkovo Bulge. Hitler's command threw on the breakthrough the striking group of Kleist's army group, which included 2 tank, 1 motorized and 8 infantry divisions. Among the countermeasures taken by the Soviet command was the decision to halt the enemy offensive near the town of Izyum. The combat situation at this point was extremely tense. By the end of the day, the Germans occupied the outskirts of the city, conducted intensive artillery and mortar shelling of the Izyum railway station, simultaneously bombing the only bridge across the Seversky Donets, which served as a crossing to the left bank for our retreating troops. May 18th, 343rd Infantry Division was raised on alert and began the march to Izyum. And on the next day the combat order came, to force the Seversky Donets and take Izyum. 2 regiments, 1153rd and 1155th, were to force the river north of Izyum and knock the Germans out of the city. And our 1151st Regiment was tasked by the division commander to cross the Seversky Donets south of Izyum, capture the heights where the enemy was entrenched, and thus block the city from the south. These heights were about a kilometre from the shore, and between them and the river was a fairly dense forest area. Regimental Commander Major Is. F. Kilchevsky decided to carry out the crossing at night on improvised means. Battalions were to concentrate in the forest, and, at dawn, after a short artillery preparation to attack the enemy. I was ordered to cross with the 1st Battalion to deploy the regimental NP at the edge of the forest and personally lead the battle. The regimental commander remained at his CP on the left bank. I must say that during the preparation of the combat order, I expressed to Major Kilchevsky my concerns about the fact that the attack on the heights, essentially from the get-go, could be unsuccessful, because the division headquarters provided us with very scanty data on the enemy. We ourselves did not conduct reconnaissance and reconnaissance of the terrain. I suggested that we should first look around, do a reconnaissance by combat to at least partially reveal the system of enemy fire on the heights, and then take them. But the regiment commander did not agree with my arguments. "Act, Naumenko," he said. "Battalions, you know, replenished with personnel, ammunition is enough. We must take the heights." What could I do? I answered, "Yes," and went to the river. I met there the commander of the 1st Company, Lieutenant P.I. Melnikov. Together with him and another group of soldiers, we got into a boat and swam. We knew that there were no Hitlerites on the opposite bank, and the soldiers therefore acted calmly. One by one, the units crossed the river and dispersed into the forest. Fascists probably did not find out our crossing. In any case, they did not conduct massive fire on the river, only occasionally slapped into the water shells, raising foamy fountains. And it had to happen that one of the shells exploded on the water not far from the place where I was sitting on the right bank, watching the fighters crossing. In the darkness, I didn't notice the explosion. I only felt how the blast wave shook me and felt a ringing in my ears. Then the ringing stopped, but my left ear started to ache, as if water had got there. I did not pay attention to it then, but I began to hear worse, and only after the war, in 1946, when I entered the academy and passed the medical commission, the otolaryngologist discovered a scar on the eardrum of my left ear. That's when the trace of the frontline contusion opened up. At dawn, our cannons and mortars struck from the left bank of the river. The heights were covered with smoke from shell bursts, and our battalion went on the attack. We had to overcome some 300 to 400 metres of open space between the forest and the first trench of the enemy defence on the slopes of the heights. I could clearly see from the NP how the targets of the 1st Battalion Riflemen were running in friendship, but not even half the distance to the enemy trenches they lay down. As might be expected, the short artillery preparation failed to suppress enemy firepower. The attack collapsed, and the men withdrew to their original positions. I reported this to the regiment commander by phone, asking him to repeat the fire attack. Although, frankly speaking, I did not count on it much. I knew that the regiment was not full of shells and mines at that time. But maybe the division headquarters would help. In response, I heard the irritated voice of Major Kilchevsky. "I have no fire, Naumenko, no. But that by evening the heights were taken. Understood? That day 4 times went to attack the soldiers, but all to no avail. We lost almost half of our personnel. And I was once again convinced that the straightforward tactics of frontal assault of fortified positions cannot succeed, if not suppressed most of the enemy's firepower. At night our headquarters crossed to the western bank of the Seversky Donets. The next day the regiment commander ordered to resume attacks, and again we could not knock the Germans from the heights. Yes, at that difficult time there were many miscalculations in the organisation and conduct of the battle. Other commanders, not considering the losses, threw the soldiers into the attack for the sake of a momentary tactical success. On May 22nd, Izium was liberated by 2 other regiments of the 343rd Rifle Division. But our regiment also played its role in this. We did not allow the enemy, entrenched on the heights, to come to the aid of the garrison of the city. In those days it became known that the decree of the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet of the USSR established the Order of the Patriotic War of the I and II degrees. On the instructions of the Commissar of the regiment in the units were held political informations dedicated to this event. Looking ahead, I will say that I received the Order of Patriotic War of the I degree only a year later for forcing the Dnieper. And by the 40th anniversary of the victory in April 1985, I, as well as all frontline soldiers who were wounded, was awarded another one of the same order. On May 23rd, Kleist's army group joined 10 kilometres south of Balakleya, with parts of Paulus's 6th Army, encircling our troops on the Bavenkovo Bulge. Only 22,000 of our soldiers and commanders escaped from the encirclement on May 29th. So the May offensive operation of our southwestern front ended in failure. The 343rd Rifle Division was ordered to consolidate on the defensive lines southwest and west of Izium, and not to allow the enemy to reach it. Our regiment at the end of May and the first decade of June was engaged in improving the positions, reconnaissance of the enemy. This time was also memorable because in the floodplain of the Seversky Donets, in the forest where the regiment was located, there were untold hordes of mosquitoes. They did not give us peace neither day nor night, and many soldiers and commanders walked with swollen faces. One day, in June, the commander of the 1st Battalion, Senior Lieutenant Nikolai Abukhov, came to the regiment headquarters. He received a letter from his mother with the news about the death of his 2 brothers at the front. After listening to Nikolai, we all sat in silence for a long time. Words of consolation were of little use here. The silence was broken by Senior Lieutenant V.S. Zelenin, a senior operative of the Special Department. "Be strong, combat," he said. "You are a strong man. You will not be bent by trouble. But this letter would be good to publish in our division newspaper. The words of the mother, coming from the depths of the soul, will be a strong agitation charge." All agreed with Zelenin's proposal, and soon in the heroic campaign were printed heartfelt lines. "Hello, my dear son, my dear falcon. The fascists killed your 2 brothers, Grisha and Misha. How hard it is for me, but I ask you to take revenge on the enemy, my son. Be a hero, my dear, and beat Hitler's bastards even harder. Remember, Grisha wrote you to beat the enemy without mercy. Fulfill the testament of your dead brother. I give you my motherly blessing. Let your hand never miss, let your eye be marked, and your heart never waver. Avenge them, the bastards, for the torment of the people, for your brothers. Don't worry about us, dear son. Soon only smash the damned Hitler, and come home with victory. Kisses, your mother, A.K. Abukova." But she was not destined to see her 3rd son, Nikolai, in a brutal battle in Stalingrad, and he died heroically. But I will tell you about it in the next chapter.